It's hard to visualize the depth of human cruelty until you get acquainted with the story of Theodor Eicke, a man whose name became a symbol of terror in Nazi Germany. Architect of the concentration camp system and one of the most ruthless SS commanders, Eicke left a trail of horror and death in his wake that still can send chills down your spine today. What was his path? How did an ordinary official turn into one of the most brutal criminals of the 20th century? Let's figure it out together. You're watching Ex-War History, and we continue. A difficult child. We all have a certain period of life we commonly call childhood, and we have to admit that this also applies to Theodor Eicke. From a very young age, he demonstrated the qualities that later turned him into a Nazi executioner. Theodor was born on October 17, 1892, in the town of Hüdingen, now Empont in Lorraine. This is already indicative. The Germans, living in this disputed region, were especially characterized by great power German chauvinism in contrast to the muted discontent of the local French population. Theodor was the 11th child in the family. However, the Eicke family became so large not because of a special love of children and not even for religious reasons, as it can be, but simply because it happened that way. No one was particularly engaged in the development and upbringing of children there. History has not preserved the name of the mother, but it seems that she was distinguished by an extremely low level of intellect. To put it simply, a rather not far-sighted woman. His father, Heinrich Eicke, was a fairly wealthy man in his youth, but he lost everything because of his addiction to the bottle. He was an alcoholic. At the time of Theodor's birth, his father was the head of the local tiny railway station, and the family huddled there in a small caretaker's house. Eicke's children were poor and not really smart. Because of this, they were laughed at. It was the same with Theodor, when he was sent to school in due time. But this boy's reaction to ridicule turned out to be specific. Young Theo studied very badly. He didn't succeed in any subject, did not like to, and did not want to study. But he was not just a loser, but a loser with a character, a typical uncontrollable violent child. Theo constantly fought, was engaged in petty extortion, and his training ended with a serious beating of the teacher at the age of just 17 years old. Young Eicke was a big, physically strong guy, completely devoid of compassion and distinguished by that kind of courage that is usually called recklessness. After it became clear that studying was not his element, Eicke took another step. He went to serve in the army. For a soldier, many of his qualities turned out to be quite useful, but the officers treated him ambivalently. On the one hand, Eicke perfectly fulfilled orders, respected subordination. On the other hand, he constantly clashed with his colleagues and started fights, mainly in a state of severe intoxication. Therefore, for the period from 1909 to 1914, the soldier changed 3 regiments. The First World War was greeted enthusiastically by Eicke. As part of the 22nd Bavarian Regiment, he served in Flanders. During the First Battle of Ypres, October 1914, he casually met another soldier, the Austrian Adolf Hitler, and in April 1915, he witnessed a gas attack here. Judging by the letters, Eicke liked the war very much. He was not afraid of bayonet attacks, the sight of corpses of people suffocated by gases, unsanitary conditions, shelling and death. He adored all of it and could show his true face. During the war, Eicke rose to the rank of non-commissioned officer and received 3 awards. But since 1916, he was kept in a reserve machine gun company, probably for the same reason of scandal and fierceness. And in 1919, he retired from the army. By the way, on his own, for ideological reasons. Theodor Eicke did not want to serve the Weimar Republic because he considered its very establishment to be a betrayal of Germany. So simply, a badly educated soldier began to turn into a Nazi. A turn into a Nazi. After an unsuccessful and not long attempt to retrain as an accountant, Theodor Eicke in the same 1919 took what seemed to be another step. He got a job in the police. The case would have been suitable for him, if not for an important but. This officer of the law used his official position to agitate against the Weimar Republic. This is not allowed in any civilized country. In addition, Eicke put together a small group of like-minded people from his colleagues who engaged in a profitable business, terror with robberies against Jews and members of left-wing parties using their official position. When in 1923 these people beat 3 communists to death with bats without a sanction from above, the case was hushed up, but not completely. Eicke did fly out of the police with a bang, so then he had to get a job as a security guard at IG Farben. It was there that he met Josef Bürkel, who already had some authority in the Nazi environment. Eicke and Bürkel understood each other pretty quickly, and on December 1st, 1928, Theodor received a membership card of the NSDAP. Soon Hitler personally noticed him during one of his speeches to his party comrades. He recognized a former army colleague. A better career kick could not have been wished for. In 1930, Eicke began to grow in the SS, and, what is no less important, under the benevolent control of Himmler himself. By 1932, he already had the rank of commander of an SS regiment. In the same 1932, an attempt was made to blow up the car of the mayor of the city of Ludwigshafen in Rhineland-Pfalz, where Eicke's regiment was stationed. There were no casualties, but there was enough noise. And soon there was an explosion at a meeting of a communist cell. Someone dragged a bomb there. Well, 5 people were injured, and the search led to Eicke. The sentence was more than lenient, just 2 years for all of this. But Eicke did not have to sit at all. The Minister of Justice of Bavaria, Franz Güttner, already known for pulling the Führer out of the prison with his closest associates, who received sentences in 1924 for the beer hall putsch, came to the rescue. In his opinion, Theodor Eicke, a huge SS thug, was having poor health and therefore should have been released under house arrest. Well, it's irrational to spend money on strict protection of the sick. It's not normal for such ill, poor people. In Italy, he ran a military training camp for SS refugees and even served as a guard for Mussolini himself. Moreover, he so brazenly promoted the ideas of Nazism that many Italians were indignant. Wasn't it way too zealous, albeit friendly, but still a neighboring state meddling in their affairs? At the beginning of 1933, the Nazis officially came to power in Germany. This made it possible for Theodor Eicke to return home. He celebrated his return by locking Josef Bürkel, his former mentor in Nazism, in a closet for several hours. They did not share influence in Rhineland-Pfalz. On July 30, 1934, on the night of the Long Knives, Eicke once again proved his loyalty to Himmler and the Führer by participating in the massacre of stormtroopers from the SA. On July 2nd of the same year, he personally became the assassin of their leader, Ernst Röhm, shooting him in a prison cell. From what has been said, it is already obvious. Theodor Eicke was, as they say, the ideal watchdog of Nazism. But at the same time, the field of his activity was much wider than just terror against undesirables. And his career did not develop linearly. In 1933, immediately after returning to his homeland, Eicke ended up in a mental hospital for several months. In a hospital for mentally ill. Yes, in the literal sense, the Nazi ended up in a hospital for the mentally ill, as a madman who poses the danger to society. There is a version that this is how his former friend Bürkel took revenge on him for staying in the closet. But another option is also quite possible. It is known that Eicke drank a lot and constantly, and alcoholics were one of the profiles of psychiatric institutions even back then. From the mental hospital, Eicke sent numerous letters to Himmler, demanding protection from arbitrariness. In the end, one of them reached the addressee, and in June 1933, Himmler personally secured the release of the Nazi. By the way, Eicke even helped his Jewish psychiatrist to flee abroad. He didn't hold a grudge against that man. Well, Himmler preferred to keep him away from Bürkel and Rhineland-Pfalz. It would be calmer for himself, and he sent Eicke to a place which name was not yet particularly famous, Dachau. It was there that the freshly cured patient of psychiatry really found himself. It was at Dachau that Theodor Eicke became the creator of Hitler's ruthless system of concentration camps. And here another of his brainchildren was born, the Death's Head Division. At the core origins of horror. On June 26, 1933, Theodor Eicke officially took up the post of commandant of the Dachau concentration camp, established in March of the same year. The task of the new commandant was to restore order in the camp, since the first commandant, Hilmar Weckele, did not care about his duties, and the level of discipline of the guards was nowhere lower. Theodor Eicke approached the matter wholeheartedly. He replaced half of the guards, 60 out of 120, and established iron discipline among them. As a truly devoted man, he distributed the prisoners to various jobs, not forgetting the IG Farben, where he had once worked. The forced, exhausting labor of the prisoners made Dachau very profitable, and Eicke himself also had something of his enterprise. To ensure the total obedience of the prisoners, the new commandant introduced a system of punishments. Many violations were punishable by death, minor offenses, flogging, an average of 25 lashes. All punishments were necessarily public, with both prisoners and guards fully assembled. The guards used the prisoners as human targets for shooting or bayonet fighting. There were cases when groups of prisoners were released into the field, after which they were opened fire on them for entertainment or training of soldiers. Within the camps, sophisticated methods of torture were used. Prisoners were hung by their hands behind their backs, which led to dislocations and ruptures of the joints. They were forced to stand naked in the cold, deprived of food and water for a long time. The guards felt that any of their actions would remain without consequences. The complaints of the prisoners were ignored, and any manifestations of sympathy on the part of the staff were harshly suppressed. Eicke also ordered all of the guards, without any single exception, to personally partake in the execution of sentences, to beat and kill. It was a kind of psychology that the SS men serving in the camp had to turn brutal cruelty into a routine for themselves, into an everyday boring duty. And the method, despite everything, worked. The changes at Dachau made such a good impression on Himmler that he promoted Eicke once again, making him SS Brigadeführer, which corresponds to a major general in the army, and on January 30, 1934 transferred him to the higher position of inspector of concentration camps. The new Brigadeführer was to rebuild existing concentration camps and create new ones according to the existing system he had devised and applied at Dachau. Thus, Eicke turned out to be the father of the entire Hitlerite camp system, aimed at the murderous exploitation of the enemies of the Reich. It was indeed economic growth on deaths. No, he didn't invent the very idea of using the labor of concentration camp prisoners. He simply made this exploitation as effective as possible. There was no reason to worry. The material is consumable. Either the prisoner works or dies. In addition to physical violence, psychological pressure was used. Prisoners were forced to watch others tortured, deprived of sleep, and subjected to constant threats. This led many to mental breakdowns and suicide, thus separating the more weak and more mentally strong, according to Eicke. It was also to Eicke that Hitler's camp system owed much to the complex system of dehumanization used in it. These are humiliations themselves, reprisals, and inhuman conditions of existence. Even more so, it's important to understand that both prisoners and guards were processed at the same exact time, making it, as said earlier, more effective. The production of weak-willed and powerless draught animals and ruthless, insensitive, cold-bloodedly cruel overseers went on in parallel and complemented each other. The system really turned out to be like a conveyor. So the Night of the Long Knives became a kind of part-time job for Eicke, not particularly related to the performance of his main duties as a camp inspector. Until 1938, he was engaged in camps, including creating new and training personnel for the camp leadership and guards. Among his disciples were the commandant of Auschwitz Höss, the architect of the Holocaust Eichmann, and the commandant of Buchenwald Koch. In the year 1938, Himmler removed the economic component of concentration camp activities from Eicke's jurisdiction. It was disadvantageous to the hero of the episode financially, but it was not a punishment. Himmler simply eliminated the corruption component in his department in this strict way, preventing the excessive strengthening of anyone except himself. The fight for influence and power was always present among Hitlerites. In improving the camp system, Eicke also took care of the creation of paramilitary units that were supposed to serve in the camps and ensure their safety. After all, large crowds of people who had nothing to lose. This is how a unit called Death's Head appeared. By 1938, it had 4 regiments stationed in Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, and Buchenwald. Immediately after the outbreak of war, 3 of the 4 Totenkopf regiments turned into Einsatzgruppen, engaged in terror on Polish lands. Eicke's SS men were engaged in robberies and murders of the local population, preferring murdering Jews first and foremost. Everyone who has heard of the SS Totenkopf division must understand. This is not it, just yet. But the future shock unit of the Waffen-SS really grew out of this camp army, and also through the efforts of Theodor Eicke. As a Death's Head leader. The SS division appeared after the beginning of the war, in October 1939. The camp regiments created by Eicke became its basis, though, as a result, some of the old deadheads ended up in other SS units, and candidates from other units were also selected for the new division. Theodor Eicke naturally became its commander. It must be said that this commander treated his soldiers a little better than he treated the prisoners of concentration camps. Their lives were of no value to him. The education of personnel in Death's Head was based on unconditional loyalty and reckless personal courage, but not on any common sense. It is very clear that the poorly educated Eicke, who had not mastered basic grammar until the end of his life, didn't have a general idea of tactics and strategy. Consequently, the Death's Head mainly stormed head-on. They attacked the enemy without looking back at their losses. Considering that the division was a tank division, it did give results and scared the enemy. The division first took part in the battles in France in 1940. At the same time, Eicke commanded his unit frankly unwisely, and he took absolutely poor care of its support and supplies. Even the Wehrmacht general called him a butcher of their men. But nevertheless, the division still made its mark in the battles in Belgium and northern France. At the same time, Eicke's soldiers demonstrated the same habits in the war that they had back in Dachau and other camps. For example, they didn't bother to figure out who resisted them and who openly surrendered. Eicke was one of the first in France to shoot prisoners of war without much disparity, starting with 97 Englishmen killed on May 26, 1940 in the Pont-de-Calais department. After a long rest and replenishment, and it was so much required, in France, Eicke with his Death's Heads went to the most relevant theater of military operations in the year 1941, to the resistant Eastern Front. The division was part of the Army Group North and operated in the Baltic states. Soldiers under Eicke's command often entered villages and massacred all the inhabitants. They shot men, they shot women, and didn't have mercy on children. In some rare cases, people were locked in buildings and set on fire. Captured Soviet soldiers were not sent to prisoner of war camps. Instead, they were shot en masse. There were cases when prisoners were forced to dig their own graves before consequent execution. Prisoners and local residents were brutally tortured to obtain information or simply because of attitude towards them. People were beaten, bones were broken, and they were mutilated. In September 1941, Totenkopf defeated 3 Soviet divisions near Lake Ilmen. In January 1942, during the Demyansk offensive operation of the Red Army, the division, along with several other units, was surrounded, and it became the main force of the breakthrough of the Encircled, which took place in March to April. At the same time, the casualties amounted to 80% of the personnel. Eicke put the lightly wounded into the ranks. His tanks were repaired on the move, meekly endured severe frosts. On July 6, 1941, Eicke's staff car was blown up by a Soviet mine, and Eicke suffered a serious leg injury, but returned to the front in September. His son Hermann, born in 1920, died in battle on December 2, 1941. Many of his relatives served in Eicke's division, and knowing his love of frontal attacks, it's not difficult to understand what such poorly maintained protection turned out to be. The leadership of the Reich valued both the most unconditionally loyal soldier and his followers. After Demyansk, the division rested for a long time in France, where it managed to take part in the occupation of Upper France, and Eicke received the ranks of SS General and Obergruppenführer, analog to the general of a branch of the armed forces in the army. In January 1943, Eicke's division and he himself again left France for the Eastern Front. It was about the so-called Third Battle of Kharkov, when German troops tried to push the Red Army back from the utterly important city with a counterattack. A justly deserved end. On February 26, 1943, Eicke was informed that one of the regiments of his division was not communicating. The general immediately climbed into a small Fieseler Fi-156 Storch reconnaissance aircraft and personally went to investigate. Not far from the village of Mikhailovka, he seemed to notice tanks and ordered the pilot to descend. The aircraft was shot down. But this is the official version. There is another one, which does not completely contradict the official one but rather complements it. Allegedly, Eicke went to his inspection in a state of strong intoxication, which was actually a common thing for him. It was not for nothing that the madman was placed in a mental hospital. He quarreled with the pilot, made unreasonable demands on him, and in the end ordered him to specially descend over the village clearly occupied by the Soviets. in order to look at the enemy. Many soldiers of the Red Army opened fire on a light single-engine reconnaissance aircraft, one way or another, but the result is the same. The plane was hit, crashed, and caught in huge fire. Eicke's body was later identified only by a cross with oak leaves. In the Third Reich, the murdered executioner was honored with a magnificent obituary, and one of the Totenkopf regiments even received his name. This is how came an end of one of the most terrible Nazis of the 20th century. Thank you for watching. We hope that you found it educational, and in case if you want to watch other episodes we have, click on the screen, subscribe and leave a like, and see you later on the channel.